Okay, 171 guys, I want to review this chapter with you. I think we've gone over some of this stuff, plus you guys did this chapter last week as a reading assignment and a lecture assignment, but I wanted you to hit on a couple of the high points here. The first thing is, again, chapter 9, transmission transaxle diagnosis and service. Good fluid level check. Make sure you don't have any moisture in there, water in there. Water contamination is very, very bad for a manual transmission. It can cause rusting, cracking in the case, all kinds of things. So make sure you're clean there. So again, sometimes you'll have a physical dipstick you can use. Sometimes you'll just have a fill plug that you make sure you're level to the fill plug. But that's pretty much what you see in a manual transmission. Shifting issues. If you do have a particular gear that you're having problems with shifting, you want to try to identify if the issue is in the selector assembly, the shifter assembly, in the cables or the linkage, or internal in the transmission. And that may require you to pull the levers off, pull the cables off, and manually shift or manipulate the outside of the transmission to put it in the particular gears. What I typically do is, if I have a customer complain of a shifting issue, I would first, by taking the vehicle with the engine turned off, make sure the clutch isn't dragging, causing some misdiagnosis, but make sure the engine's turned off and physically manipulate the shifter through all the gears to make sure you feel a good detent, make sure you're not sliding into an interlock issue, or make sure you got a positive feel as that vehicle goes in each one of the gears. Then if you start the vehicle and you're still having problems manipulating the shifter, or you're having problems getting in the gear as it's running, you want to make sure the clutch is fully disengaged. If the clutch is not disengaged, you may have some resistance and some problems with the blocker ring preventing you from going in gear. So if you make sure that clutch is completely released. If the clutch is released, each one of these gears should go into, basically feel like they're going in just like they would sitting still with your foot in the clutch, just like that as you were doing it with the engine off. So it should feel about the same. If you test drive the vehicle and you have problems getting into one of the gears in particular, in a lot of cases that'll be an internal transmission issue. It'll be a bad worn blocker ring or a bad bushing or an interlock or something wrong with that particular shifting mechanism inside the transmission. But those are things you want to look for. Again, this is a pretty good description of basic fundamental checkouts. Again, engine alignment is probably important to make sure the engine is positioned correctly. Watch for motor mounts. A lot of the vehicles back in the day when they were rear-wheel drive, this was actually attached to the vehicle, and then you had attached to the interior of the vehicle, and then you had selector rods coming off of this to manipulate the transmission. And if it broke a motor mount or you had a twisted motor mount, a lot of cases this wasn't aligned correctly, you wouldn't be able to get into the proper gears at the proper time. So check your motor mounts, make sure your engine is aligned correctly. Just some good solid manual transmission diagnosis. Another thing you look for is any types of vibration and noises. Sometimes it's just the U-joint. If you see rust on the drive shaft like this through a visual inspection, you want to definitely get that U-joint changed. It's more likely to be a rear U-joint. For some reason, rear U-joints, I think it's just because they flex more. They tend to have a little bit more shorter life than the front U-joints. But then definitely watch those U-joints in some cases. That may be all you're dealing with. In this part of the book, they talk about supporting the engine if you had to do a transmission rebuild or removal. If you do remove a rear-wheel drive transmission, a lot of cases you can support the engine with a jack stand of some sort or a tall post or a sling of some sort. Sometimes you can just let the engine hang down and it'll be enough free space there. In a front-wheel drive, you definitely have to put something like this on, though. You can buy these commercially. They're little engine supports. We used to use, believe it or not, we used to block 4x4 blocks on either side, and we put a piece of steel across that. If we had something, a large piece of angle iron, you can get some threaded rods and make some hooks on the end, make your own little adjusters. Another thing we used to do is later in life, these ratchet straps you guys can buy. Really heavy ratchet strap around the outside of that, and just click it up with a ratchet strap, and that's really all you need. You just need to support that engine so it doesn't tip down too far. You want to break the exhaust or break something else on the car. So be aware of that. That's just an engine support sling. It's going to definitely need it for most front-wheel drive applications. Obviously, check for leaks. Make sure you're plugging the cap on a loose fluid. So once you get your transmission down, when you start taking it apart, really, I can't emphasize this anymore. I'm gonna double this with any of the repairs, make sure you have good service information. A good solid service manual on how to disassemble and reassemble that transmission is critical with manual transmissions. There's a lot of times you'll look at something like, man, I can get that apart. It should come apart. And then unfortunately there's like a hidden fastener or an extra bolt somewhere you got to take off or pin you got to drive out, and you end up damaging the case and damaging a shaft. Follow the procedure exactly in the service information. If you can't get step-by-step procedure information for a disassembly and a reassembly, don't attempt it. Should be no reason that you can't find step-by-step procedure. Okay, so you're going to follow that on the disassembly. Again, they're talking about parts that are needs, just a general idea what parts you need. Sometimes you can buy a repair kit. A lot of cases now today, your overhaul kits for manual transmissions may only come with some of the blocker rings and the seals, but not all the bearings. The bearings may be some additional cost. I highly recommend taking the transmission apart, making yourself a parts list, and then order what you need. If you can find an overhaul kit, this is actually a T5 manual transmission overhaul kit, and it's relatively popular. You can probably find one of these on eBay or one of the sites and get that ordered and get that in and rebuild it. But if it's an off-brand tranny or a tranny they don't have lots of applications for, you may have to buy all those parts individually. Okay. And again, through here, they're taking you through some disassembly procedures, and they're, talking about how you would typically take it apart, drain the fluid out, inspect the cases. Sometimes there's some special pullers that are required to take it apart. Just make sure you have all that stuff. Okay, a few cautions throughout this book. They do talk about what to look for when you take your transmission parts out. Obviously, this is just a pattern on a bearing. In most cases, you're not going to see an issue here unless you had a support bearing that failed. If the support bearing fails, sometimes you're going to get some odd wear on the gears, and at that point you're going to be into changing gears. I will tell you though, if you do get into a gear or shaft replacement, you're going to get into some serious cash, because in a lot of cases those parts are either not available, or if they are available, they're at a really, really high retail value. So unless you get a very common transmission, some of these things may not even be available to you. Okay, blocker rings, bearings, gaskets, yes. Big gears, big shafts, maybe not. Okay, so again, they're taking you through some of these disassemblies. So, okay, one of the things they do talk about on the reassembly, and we already talked about this, is that blocker ring end gap. Remember, we talked about that, I think, last week. But make sure you're checking your blocker ring end gap. Very, very important. Okay, and reassembly, there are some of these blocker rings where they actually have these little I guess they'd call them threads. These threads would wear out. And at that point, you'd go ahead and replace those. And I'll be completely honest with you. If I've got that out, I'm putting a new one in. That's your wear component internal to the manual transmission. Okay, so make sure you're putting those in. Oil groove alignment. Make sure you put things in correctly. Again, that's why it's important to make sure you're watching those service information, getting that proper service information. This particular measurement they're taking with a feeler gauge is basically going to be your shift fork and wear cap side clearance. You're going to get, looking up that, that's about 30 thousandths of an inch, and that's just off those little wear patches. This can be ordered. You can buy those little feet in some cases, or you're going to buy the entire fork. But if that gets worn out, you're going to find a vehicle that you put it in gear, and that sleeve's not going to slide and get a full engagement, and it's going to pop out of gear. So make sure you watch that. Okay, case halves, not a big deal there. You're looking for things that are broke. Couple measurements. You guys have all done that with automatic transmission. You're measuring your end plays, measuring some of your clearances. Maybe there's a selector shim that you gotta replace. Sealants, case sealers. Most cases they're going to use a room temperature vulcanizing an RTV. Anything that's dissimilar will probably use that. Sometimes they'll use an anaerobic sealer, which is basically the opposite of an RTV. The anaerobic sealer is a very, very thin coat. And that stuff it dries in the absence of oxygen, whereas a room temperature sealant RTV will dry in the presence of oxygen. So they're two totally different applications. RTVs are typically thicker, and then your room temperature, your anaerobics are much, much thinner. Okay. So again, make sure you're reading through this chapter. I kind of went through that pretty quick, but you guys already did this chapter last week, but I just want to make sure I reviewed it with you. Okay.